This is the fourth bureau, also called the regular issue. I really, as a non-American collector, struggled initially with this because it didn't have this set of stamps didn't have a really clear name. So I didn't even know what to call it when I started looking into it or investigating it. I later found out that amongst philatelists, it's called the Fourth Bureau. And that's because at this time, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing was creating these stamps. And this was sort of the fourth set of stamps they had created. And in Scott, they refer to it as the regular issue, which, as far as I can tell, means it's the definitives. So these were the regular day-to-day stamps that were being used, and they were produced between 1922 and 1930. So here's what they look like. Um, we see amongst the portraits a lot of reused portraits that we have seen in prior issue stamps. They were not particularly creative in coming up with new ones. Hayes here at 11 is new, and we also here have Hala Hornbear here, who was a very renowned leader of the indigenous people, and he had the um, ignominious honor of having his name stripped off the stamp and just being put as American Indian. You also see here a horseshoe frame on the Statue of Liberty. So this sort of differs from the other frames, which are all more round or oval. And then the higher issues, you've got these landscapes. So they were doing some pretty landscapes here. Um, Two other new ones, which I'll be talking about in the discussion, are the ones with the half cent and the 1.5 cent. This is Nathan Hale, and this is President Harding. And I'll talk a little bit more about those, but those came later. Initially, it was just the 1, 2, 3, 4 cents. So the number one stamp was the rate at which I wanted to say spam, the junk mail was sent, the commercial mail. So you will find anyone who has like any accumulation of American stamps will have a lot of these um, Benjamin Franklin 1 cents. Now, one of the things I should talk about why I'm doing a presentation on um, the Fourth Bureau stamps. And I want to say I'm talking about specifically the regular issue stamps here. I'm not talking about all the Fourth Bureau stamps, which also include commemoratives, airmail, post, like all that were all stamps that were produced from the era of 1922 to 1930. I'm simply talking about the definitive set that you see here. And there was a lot of experimentation that was going on, and I'm going to explain what was actually happening because it was very confusing to me when I first started this. And so you will have the same image, like this number one Franklin, but it's being produced in 8 different stamps. And you need to understand all the little technical details to be able to distinguish each stamp from the other because the image is identical. And so, in the case of the 1 cent Franklin, there's actually some rare, very valuable stamps that appear identical to the very, very common one. And you will need to understand the technical issues to be able to distinguish the really expensive one from the very common one. And so, I will be going over that as we go through the presentation. So, everyone who has any accumulation of American stamps probably has this stamp. Um, and then the other one that was very, very common was the 2 cent. And this was the rate at that time to send a regular letter. So every letter you sent to your aunt or to a business or anything had a 2 cent stamp on it. So these are also very common. And then the rate was 5 cents to send internationally at this time. So these are sort of the workhorses of this set. And then in, I think it was 1930 or maybe it was 28, no, 30, they replaced the 1.5 cent and the 4 stamp. So they didn't upgrade. You have a nicer image here in 1.5 of Harding, and then they replaced Martha Washington with Taft. Not sure why. So the topics I'll be going over, here's just a picture of the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. The Bureau, this was confusing to me too, so I had to look it up. Their primary responsibility was printing money, so this is very serious. And they also got the contract to print stamps back when they began with the red triangle stamp, which I did a presentation on. all the photos, almost all the photos you'll find in this presentation are pictures from the Bureau of Engraving and Printing at the time that they were printing the Fourth Bureau stamps.
I don't know.
Um,
I don't know if you can still do it, but a couple of years ago, I actually went there, and you can watch them printing and cutting the money and everything.
oh, that would be fascinating. And then the other thing that's a little strange to me is that back then, stamps were considered a source of revenue, like a source of money. Like you could actually pay taxes with stamps. You know, they were considered of value, and so they were treated with the same seriousness as money was. The same strict regulations to make sure that no one stole them. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So the topics we're going to go through that you need to understand to figure out what stamp you have from this era is flat place versus rotary press, joint line pairs, gum breaks, the Kansas-Nebraska overprints, color, pre-cancels, fractional postage, perforations, coil waste, sheet waste, and special paper. So these are a lot of technical items that I had no idea about before I started collecting these stamps. So first we're going to go into printing methods, the flat plate versus rotary. So here we have the flat plate machines that were being used at the time of the regular issue in 1922 when they were first coming out. And you can see you had three people manning a station, and it was very gender coded. So the women were over here doing something, and then the actual flat plate was run by a man. I found this picture on this website, which sort of shows this. This is the block where the stamps would have been. This is money, but it's the exact same machine. So this is where you would have had your plate with the engraving for the stamps. This is chalk that they would use to wipe off the excess ink by hand. That's why his hands are all inked up here. Also confusing to me is this method, flat plate printing, is also called intaglio printing, line engraving, recess printing, or copper plate process. So when you see these terms, they're talking about flat plate printing.
I believe it's pronounced the N is silent.
Oh,
Italio.
is it?
Italio. Mhm.
Italio printing. So here's an example. So when you have any, what even with rotary press, all stamps start at this time with a die, a master die, and this is softened steel that they carve out an image before they harden it, and the image that they carve out will be the mirror image of what actually happens in the stamp. And one concept that I had to sort of wrap my head around is that the ink in the type of printing that they're using here sinks down into the recesses of the engraving. It's not sitting on top. They actually wipe all the excess ink off the top, and then they press the paper down into those recesses. So what comes out as dark is going to be recessed into the actual engraving. Here's another example of a master die and the printing it created. This is a tool that they would have used to actually create these master dies to sort of carve it out of the steel. So once you have a master die, you need to transfer some way to transfer it so you can put it on a plate with multiple images. And you do that using a transfer roll. So this is a round cylinder that you rock back and forth over your image in the master die to make a reverse copy of it. So here's a transfer roll. And once you have that reverse copy, and usually there's like two copies. I couldn't find out exactly how many copies fit on a transfer roll, but it's more than one, I think. And then you have here, you can see down here, here's your transfer roll, here's your plate, and you rock the transfer roll, you roll it across the plate, imprinting multiple versions of that image across the plate. And the person who did this was a siderographer. Um, and that's who this gentleman is here. That's his role. And you create a plate that usually had 400 images on it. And this is the flat plate that was used to create stamps. So then, as I mentioned, you have paper. You need to wet it because you're going to that paper needs to be absorbent to absorb the ink. So it's wetted and then it's squeezed, the wet paper is squeezed to squeeze out the excess paper. And here in this image, you can see this is the wetted paper over here. The plate is then inked and a wiper removes the excess ink. The moist paper is then pressed down and forced into the plate, absorbing the ink in the plate's recesses. So I found this very old picture. This picture is from the Bureau. This is the Bureau printing stamps. Obviously, it's not from the same era as the regular issue, but I just thought it was a great visual of how this process worked. So you have your plate here with all your engravings. You put the moistened paper over top the plate. You pull down here. He's got a lever to pull down to really force the ink up into the paper, and you can see his hands are really inked because he would have wiped off the excess ink with his hands, which would have been chalk to absorb some of that ink as well. The next stage, and we'll talk a little bit about why they did this, they created a new press. So it's not a flat plate, it's called the Rotary Printing Press, and it was created by this man here, Benjamin Stickney. His first version is 1914. I absolutely love this picture. If you look at the wall, it's an insurance calendar from 1920, so very appropriate to the time. And bear with me, I'm just going to go on a little tangent here. So, by order of President Harding, he was fired in March 31st, 1922, along with 28 of the top officials at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. They were charged with basically making up Liberty bonds to enrich themselves. And this was a very large scandal at the time. It was a national scandal. It was in all the papers. I can't imagine the mortification that Benjamin Stickney, who was a company man, he married into the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. His wife's father was a upper official. And so that was his life's work. And he was by far the most innovative driver of technology and stamps at this time. And so he was fired. Um, and the and you can see there's some like so here in this they're talking about, this one here I think says April 24th and this one down here April 19th. So by April 19th they were beginning to realize there might be nothing to the story. They said bogus money yarn fizzles. But even April 28th, which is like a week later, they're still talking about it and you see it going for months in the papers. They're really obsessed with this. Come to find out that President Harding, who has a heart attack a year after this in 1922, was one of the most corrupt presidents in America history. And there is thinking that he fabricated this scandal as a means to divert attention off of his own fraud.
The Teapot Dome scandal.
Exactly. So after Harding died, Stickney was exonerated. He was rehired by the Bureau of Printing and Engraving in 1924 and went on to continue innovating and creating new technology for stamps. The great irony is is that the Stickney press was used to print billions of the Harding memorial and definitive stamps. And another little technical detail is that this printing press is sometimes called a web press, and that's because these rolls of paper were just called webs. A web of paper was simply a roll of paper. Here we have someone who is sticking together stamps. So the initial motivation to going from the flat plate, which they had done for 50 years, to creating the rotary press was the fact that they were creating these coils of 500 stamps. And with the flat plate, you had a strip of 20 stamps and you had to paste them end to end to end to come up with a coil of 500. And this was a lot of extra work and took a lot of extra time, this manual labor. And so they decided there has to be a quicker way to create coils than to do this. And that's where Stickney came up with the rotary printing press.
General issue of efficiency. If you got a roll of paper that's running right past the printing things 20 times a second or whatever it does, it's much faster and less and cheaper than to have people hand feeding every sheet of paper into a press and then pressing it down and so on. The basic efficiency of the stamp printing is tremendously improved.
Yeah, that's a great point, Phil. And so this is what actually was the sticking point for me and made me investigate this because it's so much more efficient. Why didn't they just switch over? If you're looking at this group of stamps, you see some coming out as rotary, some staying as flat print. Like they're all sort of staggered as to when they came out. And to me, it's such a more efficient way. I mean, we saw that printing press with a Stickney. Like, why wouldn't you be using those as soon as you had that press? Why wouldn't you switch to it immediately? And so we're going to talk a little bit about that.
Okay.
So the first rotary stamp was a coil stamp. Like I said, they were really interested in creating these coils initially. It was Scott 459, and there was small demand for it. So they thought this would be sort of like a safe stamp to try out first. As I mentioned, there was a staggered rollout, though, of these stamps. And the initial stamps had gum, perforation, and quality issues compared to the flat plate printing stamps. So not only were they of inferior quality, but because of the perforation and gum issues, they were actually really making people angry at having to deal with them. Um, However, what really pushed them was in 1923 when Harding died. I'm not going to talk about the Harding Memorial Stamp because it's not actually part of the definitive set, but it's important to understand that when he died, his fraud was not known, like his corruption was not known, and he was a populist supported president. He was very beloved. So when he suddenly died from a heart attack in office in 1923, early into his term, there was such a national grief that there was no question they needed a stamp to memorialize this. So within 29 days, they went from conception to printing off the stamps. Because people loved Harding so much, they wanted this stamp. There was unprecedented demand they had never faced before for this stamp. And so it was like all hands on deck. They're like, every printing method we have, we are going to produce this stamp. So the Harding was the first stamp that came out simultaneously, both flat plate and rotary press. And if you look at those stamps, you can really tell the quality difference between the rotary press and the flat press. The rotary is just inferior. This is what really pushed them to sort of accelerate this transition into the rotary printing press. Next, they're like, okay, well, the quality is inferior, but the 1 cent, which is used for commercial postage, the commercial people, they don't care about quality. Let's do the 1 cent pre-cancels next as a rotary. So those were the next ones they felt safe putting out as rotary. Now, while they're doing this, they're working in the background to try to fix these problems as well. And so that's where you see that staggered rollout because as Phil points out, there is such a significant cost savings to doing the rotary stamps. So they had a lot of incentive. Again, remember, this is in the background of where they've fired their biggest innovator from 1922 to 1924. He was not on site. By 1931, they had figured out all those issues. They had fixed them all, and the quality was equivalent to the flat plate. And from then on, no more flat plate stamps are issued by the United States. One thing I'm going to talk about that's important to understand with rotary printing, because this is how you're going to identify the flat plate stamps from the rotary stamps, because in philately, those are considered separate stamps. They have identical images, but they're separate stamps. So the rotary stamps, you have to bend the plate around the cylinder in the rotary, and this creates a distortion along one axis, which actually stretches out the image along that axis. What happens here, these are ones that I just pulled from my own collection. You've got a flat plate and then you've got a rotary one. This one's, see how it's slightly taller? And this one's slightly longer. The taller images, they're stretched out along this axis. So the plate would have been, curved along this way. These are not to scale. For coils, when they're in this dimension, they're called endwise because they're connected end to end to end. So you'll often hear this technical term. This confused me. That's why I'm bringing this up. You'll hear this technical term endwise coils. That's what they're referring to, is that the stamps are connected end to end, and because the coils were printed on rotary printing, they're going to be a taller image. If the plate is oriented in this direction, you end up with a wider image because it's stretched out along this axis here. And for coils, they would be connected side by side by side. So they're called sidewise coils. And so the sidewise coils are wider and the endwise coils are taller. Now, this full credit to Steve for this one. He was the one who explained this, and this was a game changer for me. So to distinguish the flat plate from the rotary based upon their size, I initially tried to measure it, and we're talking like, like was it 1.5 millimeter difference or 0.5 millimeter? Like it's an extremely small difference in the sizing, and I was trying to do it by hand, and it was just causing me a headache. And so Steve suggested just cutting off the corners so that I can overlay. And here you can see I did it so much I've already smudged up my little thing. So I cut off the corners of an image I knew was flat plate, and then I laminated it, and I would just overlay it on others and to see if it was the same size or if it was slightly taller or slightly wider. And it was so easy. And in this case, it's not, I didn't get it exactly measured up, but you can see that the back one is taller. And so this, I recommend anybody. I don't know if you can buy them on eBay or definitely you can create your own. Here's an article that also talks about this method and how important it is in distinguishing rotary from flat plate. I really recommend it. It was such a game changer. Some other little tips to distinguish them. We'll talk about perforations as a big one. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But coil stamps are all rotary. So if you have a coil, you know it's going to be rotary. If there are flecks of paint on the back, it's flat plate, and that's because they were layering the sheets one on top of the other, and so the ink from the sheet below might transfer onto the back of the sheet above it, and this is called, I think, offset, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So if they're flex, it's going to be a flat plate. If it's unwatermarked, it's going to be a flat plate. If you have perforation 11 around all of them, it's going to be a flat plate. As I said in this method, just cut out the corners. Laminating it really did help. Initially, I didn't laminate it. And then overlaying it on the stamp in question. If the frames don't match up, it's a rotary press stamp. So joint line pairs. I just want to bring this up because this was a term I didn't know what it meant. Why do they? So here's a joint line pair, and you can see there's this line that goes between these two coil stamps. So with the rotary printing press, the plate is wrapped around the cylinder, and you'll have several plates. So where the two plates meet, there's actually like a recessed area where the ink collects. So since the plates are wrapped where the ends meet, there's a seam or a joint, and the ink seeps into that and it creates this vertical line on the stamps at regular intervals. So it's just an artifact of rotary plate pressing. So when you see them, you know it's a rotary plate printing, and it's just you'll see them referred to, and now I know what that means. Like this was one of the things I loved about researching this is I found so many other little nooks and crannies of collecting that I didn't know existed, like line pairs. I didn't know what a line pair was. Now I know what they are. I'll look out for them. It's just fun.
There you go.
Gum breaks. This was another terminology I came across. People talking about gum breaks and how what the gum breaks were, and it was very confusing for me. And it turns out gum breaks were a damage control method that they enacted. So here on the left, we have a gentleman inspecting the gum. On the right, we have another gentleman who is mixing the gum. Again, these are all actual photos from the time of the Fourth Bureau at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. So it was made from tapioca dextrin gummies. They added glucose in the colder months because they found that the glucose would prevent the gum from cracking. Like they had a whole formula where like in November they start at 2% glucose and in December they moved to 3 or 4, and they would titrate it to the exact month based upon the temperature. And in 1926 they just decided let's just add 5% glucose all year round. So the rotary printing press stamps, though, because they're on a rotary, they tended to curl. And this was a real problem. They got a lot of complaints from people about this. So Their solution to that was to create what they call gum breaks. And this is to literally break the gum. They had a metal edge on the perforating machines that would create these breaks, and it would break the gum and relieve the stress so that gum isn't contracting and causing that stamp to curl up. And there are three types of gum breaks. So type 1 was the first one, and they're 5 millimeters, so you'll get 4 or 5 per stamp. Type 2 is 22 millimeters. You typically only get one gum break per stamp. And type 3, which is after 1930, so it's not really you're not going to see these in the fourth bureau. They're 12 millimeters apart, so 2 to 3. This is important if you're collecting mint stamps. It is a way to verify that the stamp is not a fraud and is genuine. And we're going to talk about that in the Kansas, Nebraska overprints. So I'm not going to go into detail about the Kansas and Nebraska overprints because they are one of the most popular and rare areas to collect in American philately, and it should be its own presentation. They're extremely highly valued. They are not definitives, they are not commemoratives, they are recognized in their own category as an experimental stamp. And what they were was the post office said, okay, let's try to reduce the administrative costs of supplying stamps on an ongoing basis to post offices across the nation. So in Kansas and Nebraska, they decided what they would do is they would supply a 1 year supply to the states, to the post office in those states, and to prevent theft. Again, remember, they considered these equivalent to money, so they had to take safety precautions to prevent theft. They're like, we'll stamp it with the name of the state on it. And so they did overprints for 1 to 10 cents. So you have Kansas and Nebraska overprints. The experiment completely failed, which is why you only see it in Kansas and Nebraska and why it's considered experimental. And the reason it failed is, first of all, the post offices are like, we don't have warehouses to store 1 year supply worth of stamps. This was not something that was well thought out. So most only got a 1 month to 3 month supply of these stamps. So it was not that many. And then the customers were really confused. They're like, well, what if I go visit my aunt in Michigan? Can I use a stamp that says Kansas? I don't, they were confused. You can, but the customers didn't realize it. So they didn't like these stamps. Because it was an experiment and it failed, there are relatively few of them. And for that reason, they're highly, highly collectible. However, the estimates are up to 50% of these stamps that are found in collections are in fact forgeries. And so the most reliable way that people use to distinguish whether it's true or if it's a forgery is there a type 2 gum break? So they're looking for either a single gum break or two at the one at the very top and one at the very bottom of that stamp to verify that it is in fact a true stamp. Color. So here, for example, is a 1 cent Franklin. And like I said, it's the exact same image, but each one of these is considered by Scott as a different stamp. And um, there's reasons both technical here. You've got the Kansas, Nebraska ones as well. And so it's really important to be able to distinguish, is this stamp actually that stamp? Because you can see this article is a little out of date. It's 2018, but you can see there's a massive difference in price, 150,000 versus 25 cents. So it's important to be able to distinguish which stamp that you have. But the point I want to make here is that even within the stamp, you get variations. Here they've got deep green, green, pale green, a lot of variations in color. You may be tempted to collect based on color. I love to collect based on color. It gives these very nice, almost artistic collages or collections of stamps. However, it's really hard to collect in color. So, for example, Scott Catalog for this particular stamp, Hayes, number 11, recognizes 4 different types of colors. But the author of this article just went into his collection, found these 11 ones here, and he also found a listing from 1936. So this is before the stamps had time to age or really be exposed to environmental factors. 1936, who claimed to have 19 different colors of this stamp. So the point is that there's an inconsistency here where Scott is listing 4, but we're clearly seeing more than 4 different colors. So how do you distinguish which one is which in Scott? And I don't have a good answer to that. This is another one of the older pictures I took from the Bureau of Engraving. This is not at the time period of the fourth issue. And they're actually mixing dye here for money, not stamps, but it's to give you a sense that they were mixing these inks batch to batch at this time. So they were mixed on site, and it was impossible to exactly duplicate the ink. So you're going to have variations simply from printing to printing. Also, ink density, the printing pressure, the plate wear all change, have some impact on the color. The paper type or the quality will also impact it. There's also subjective evaluation. What I see as light green versus pale green might be different for somebody else. You have environmental exposure over time, sun, temperature, pollution, age of the stamp often will affect it. Inconsistencies also in naming colors across catalogs. So when you're trying to collect based on color, you have this additional problem of what one catalog, like Scott Gibbons calls it, versus what Scott calls it is different, even though it may be in fact the same color. And the color guides, as Phil pointed out in his presentation on this, often use the less accurate method of paint chip, the paint chip approach. So because of all this inconsistency, I don't catalog based on color. Like it's just so hard, and I just try not to get too hung up on it because it's not an exact science at all. Pre-cancels. Okay, so Roger did a wonderful presentation on pre-cancels. There are different types of pre-cancels, and here you can see all the question marks because I didn't know what type I wasn't able to definitively, like I was guessing what kind of cancel they were. Was it an electroplate pre-cancel? Was it a hand stamp pre-cancel? Was it a bureau pre-cancel? This area really is another area that is highly collectible. I feel like you can really get into it. You can create a whole map of these pre-cancels and the different types and such. Why this is important is that the Bureau, though, did their own pre-cancels and they did them on specific stamps. So let me get into that. So first of all, a bureau pre-cancel. How can you tell what a bureau pre-cancel is? It has continuous lines. It goes right off the edge of the stamp. So that's going to be a bureau pre-cancel. It's never inverted. It's never upside down. It's nicely, boom, right on it. Why I'm talking about pre-cancels is you don't see them on the flat plate. So I don't know if you remember, but they initially started the rotary um, printing press with the coils. So the coils are all rotary. But because of the inferior image, they didn't switch all the stamps to rotary right off the bat. They kept them flat plate. But then they decided the pre-cancels, because they were going to the commercial sellers mostly, they figured, okay, the lesser quality can be done on the rotary press. So you don't see pre-cancels on flat plate stamps. So it's just another way of distinguishing flat plate from rotary stamps. So 1923, the transition to the rotary continues. So as I mentioned, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing released the 2-cent Harding Memorial Stamp. This is not part of their regular issue. They faced increasing demands, which they couldn't be met if they simply used. It could only be met if they used the rotary press. And then they had these problems: the inferior image, lack of depth, color, sharp. They had the curling issue that we talked about, which they later fixed with the gum breaks. And so they compromised by printing off these 1-cent Franklins with the Bureau print. And as I mentioned, they went to commercial printers. So they thought the inferior stamps would be okay for the commercial printers. Fractional postage. What is it? So in 1925, February 20th, so the last day of February, Congress approves a bill that will increase the salaries of the postmasters, the clerks, the postal inspectors, and the letter carriers by April 15th, 1925. So they had 1.5 months to come up with the $68 million that needed to cover these raises. They were desperate. So they instituted new services. They hiked up prices for things like special handling, assurance, COD. This was still not enough to cover the budget shortfall. So they decided that they would increase the rate of the commercial or the third class mail by half a cent. So it had been 1 cent since 1879. So for the last 50 years, it had not kept up with inflation. So it was a really good deal. And so there was a tremendous amount of industry that was built up around this very cheap mailing, this third class mailing, which is, we know it as junk mail. Nowadays, by email, it would be spam. So they raised it from 1 cent to 1.5 cents. So this was a 50% increase in income for them, which is fabulous. It covered that budget for shortfall, but it was also a 50% increase in cost to the mailers. So there was outrage about it. It was a massive increase for these establishments that were using this service. Not only that, is there was no stamps in existence that had a half cent in it. So on day one, they needed to create brand new stamps for this. So you have the 1.5 cent Harding that they created. So again, they have a month and a half to come up with this money to release a stamp to start getting this money for the budget. So they're very hard pressed. So they don't have time to create it from scratch. So what they did is they took the image from the 2 cent Harding memorial stamp, which itself had only been created in 29 days, and they used it for the 1.5. And I think you can see the diminished quality of the stamp. You can tell that it was rushed. It's just not as pretty as the one that they ended up producing later to replace it because it frankly is such poor quality. As I mentioned, there was no pre-existing options for all this third class mail, and so they had to come up from day one with a very large number of these stamps. So there's a lot of pressure for them to produce these quickly. Um, so again, just like with the Harding Memorial stamp, it was like all hands on deck. The first versions of these stamps came out both in flat plate and in the rotary printing press. Whereas the second version, once they had sort of that baseline stock available, then they converted and they did only rotary press stamps. Due to the short notice, there were no pre-cancels already. So the initial rollout of these stamps has no pre-cancels. So you will see on a local pre-cancel. So these stamps will have that hand-stamped local pre-cancels on them rather than the bureau pre-cancels. And then in 1930, they decided to replace it to make the frame be consistent with the others in the set and to do, I think, a much nicer image of Harding. I'm not sure he deserved it, but there it is. And as Phil points out, there was also a half cent that they had to do because a lot of the businesses had already bought, had mass quantities of the 1 cent Franklin that they were using. And now with the rate change to 1.5, they needed a half cent to make up the difference. Now, who is Nathan Hale? He graduated from Yale. He became a teacher at 18. He joined the American Revolution as a soldier and spy, and he was executed for the British. And this forever gave him hero status. Why he's on our stamp compared to many of there were many American Revolutionary heroes, is solely due to George Dudley Seymour, who was a rich patent lawyer. He attended Yale and there just became obsessed with Nathan Hale. And he dedicated his life to all things Hale. He bought his homestead. He made it a museum. He lived in it. Like the whole grounds were like a tribute to Hale and statues of him and things of him. Um, and so he lobbied for 2 years to have a stamp made of Hale. And he initially wanted it to be on the 1 cent. He didn't want Franklin. He wanted Nathan Hale on that 1 cent. And we've talked about that. That 1 cent Franklin was the workhorse of the set. So that would have been a tremendous coup for George Dudley Seymour. But he was denied that. They said, well, we'll put him on one of the higher denomination ones. Like we'll give him a 10 or 11. And he said, no, this man, Nathan Hale, is so important. George Dudley Seymour felt he was so important that the public needed to see him on a regular basis. So he had to be on a low denomination stamp that many people would use. So he did agree. The opportunity arose with the half cent stamp, and he agreed, okay, on that one, we can use that for Nathan Hale. Perforations. So perforations are very, very important in understanding the fourth bureau. So you're going to need a good perforation gauge, and I am not being paid in any way to plug this one. I love this perforation gauge by Unitrade. I love it because it's very flexible. It's got many different ways of measuring, and it's clear, so you can use it on covers. So stamps that are on covers, you can use this to measure. The challenge with the Fourth Bureau is you have the exact same image used, but on many different stamps. So you have to be able to distinguish the stamps based on these technical issues other than the image, and perforations is a primary consideration. So the Fourth Bureau put out stamps that were 10 perfed all around, 11 perfed all around, 11 on the top and bottom, 10 on the sides, and 11 by 10 and a half. So you have all these different perforations that you're going to have to be able to distinguish stamps that look identical based on. Here are some perforation machines that were used at that time. So the rotary press changed the actual size of the stamps. We've talked about that. There's a bit of a distortion, and that meant that they had to change the spacing of the stamps as well. And so the 11 by 11 perforation gauge, which they used on the flatbread presses, were not no longer worked for the rotary press. It left too little uncut space in the vertical gutters for a rotary press, so they had to use a different perforation. Um, they also tended to separate when curling when they did the 11 by 11. So they thought, okay, let's try 10 by 11. So this is where you see the experimentation. You start seeing, the differences in the perforation. So you have 10 by 11 rotary press. Before reaching the customers, these would crack vertically along the 10 perfs, creating strips in the post office. So people did not like this. So they're like, okay, let's try 10 by 10. However, the 10 by 10, the spacing between them was too far apart, and people complained that they were too hard to tear apart, and they were tearing the actual stamps. There are a handful of rotary stamps that have been found with odd perforations outside of these. I don't know how they got into production. No one's really sure, but it just goes to show that there was like this sort of constant experimenting with perforations going on behind the scenes during this time. So the initial rotary press, as I mentioned, were perforated at the 10 gauge. The flat press were always 11 gauge all around. But the customers, as I mentioned, they weren't happy with the 10 gauge perforations. So they built new perforating equipment. And then in 1927, they switched all the rotary press stamps to the magic formula of 11 by 10 and a half perfs. Here you've got another perforating machine going. So if you look in the Scott catalog, and really you're going to need a Scott catalog, access to one to collect this area. And if you don't have your own Scott catalog, the library has them. This is where clubs are so important. You can get it, we have Scott catalogs at the club that you can come in, in our meetings and look at. I also bought 2007 printed the Scott catalog on discs. And so I bought those and then transferred them to my computer. And I really like that because if I have the design number, they're PDFs. I just search for that design number and I'll get every reference to that particular stamp in the catalog. So it's a very quick way for me to find like all the A107s or, whatever I'm looking for. But if you look in the catalog, there's, this thing called coil waste, stamps that are coil waste. They look identical to the other stamps. And so you need to understand what coil waste is, or at least I needed to understand what coil waste was to understand why it had its own separate category. Coil waste only occurred on the 1 and 2 cent, our two workhorses of the set. And the reason for that is that the other stamps were just not printed in enough volume that it made sense to make use of the waste that they created. Whereas the 1 cents were created in such large volumes that you could take the excess paper created, or the excess stamps, I should say, created from them and do something with it. And that's what they did. And so what is waste? So rotary plates, as we've talked about, were created for coil stamps, and they produced 500 or 1,000 for the vending machines. So here's a coiling machine, and you can see how they'd strip them along here into these coils, and each coil had 500 or 1,000 stamps in it. However, these webs of stamps didn't have an even number of stamps in it. So it's not like they came to the end of the roll and that was just, was a multiple of 1,000 or 500. So there was always some bit of the stamps left over that couldn't be made into coils. So they're like, well, these are perfectly good stamps. But because they were meant originally for coils, they were only perforated in one direction. They had to perf them again. So yeah. So since these stamps were sidewise coils, they had vertical perforations, but no horizontal ones. And so rather than discard them, these stamps were perforated as needed as the flat plate stamps. So they were perfed 11s. So the perforations for the coil waste were 11 by 10 or by 11. They were printed horizontally on a rotary press. So I've been saying if they're 11 all around, they're flat plate. Let me clear that up. If they're 11 all around, they're 99% sure they're the flat plate. There are these rare instances where they are coil waste. So they were created on a rotary press, and that's where you get the wider image. So this is where, again, the technical details really matter because these are the 11 flat plates are worth 25 cents. These ones, I don't know what they are, but they're definitely worth a lot more than 25 cents. So to be able to
Yeah, they range
distinguish.
from 500 to $25,000 a piece, depending upon which one you're talking about.
Yeah, so this is where it's so important to understand these technical issues and to be able to distinguish exactly what you have. Because they were printed horizontally on the rotary press, they appear wider than the flat plate. So that's how you tell the difference. So if you have a perf 11 that is 11 on all sides and wide, you have one of these rare stamps. Confusingly, though, the post office did not recognize these as new stamps, so they made no new announcement. They just sort of mixed them up with the regular stamps and put them out, even though they were created on a rotor, they were created in this unique way from coil waste. The majority of them, which is 594, were issued from the Madison Square Station, New York. So keep your eyes open for those ones. And 595 were primarily sold in Philadelphia and New York. 594 was 1923, same with 595. 578 was 1923. So yeah, this all happened in 1923.
Everyone search anything with a Madison Square Station postmark in the date and
Exactly,
age, right?
1923.
And what makes this particularly fun looking for these stamps is they're all common 1 cent and 2 cent stamps and easily get lost.
Exactly. And so um, if you really dive into the technical issues and you can distinguish between them, it's like it's a hunt. It's a treasure hunt. Sheet waste. So we covered coil waste. Now we have sheet waste. Okay, so these were sheets that were for the rotary press. I don't fully understand. This is one I don't think I fully understood. Meant for imperforate, and they decided they were not appropriate, or the sizing wasn't quite right. If you see Kansas City, Missouri, you want to look at it to see if it qualifies as sheet waste. They appear taller than the flat plate, so they were stretched out along this dimension on the rotary press. And it was thought to be as a stopgap. It wasn't official. It was thought that somebody just, had these orders for Kansas City, Missouri, and they wanted to finish off the order and they were short. And so they used a scrap paper essentially and ran it through the rotary. And because it's rotary, they appear taller than the flat plate ones, but they are in fact perfed 11 all around. So this is another example of a rare stamp. It's worth a lot of money. That appears like a flat plate because it's perfed 11, but you have to measure it and see if it's taller. And again, that method of cutting off the corners to measure the stamps will really come in handy here. Um, so yeah, it's a 1 cent green stamp. Oh yeah, and it catalogs for more than 200,000.
That's only the Kansas City pre-cancels?
No, they're not all Kansas City, Missouri pre-cancels. There's just a majority of them that are. And so there's this theory that propped up that there were several orders that they were just short on, and somebody unofficially decided to take the initiative to just use this waste um, printing or waste paper to run through the rotary just to top up the orders.
Just the
So they,
1 cent stamp, though.
it's just the 1 cent, yes. Special paper. All right. So this is a variety. This is not its own stamp. So this was only added to the Scott catalog in 2020 as an official variety. However, it was recognized, and Southgate, who did a lot of philately during this time, academic philately, wrote a whole paper in 1939 on this, definitively showing this variety. And so I just find it interesting. It took from 1939 to 2020 for Scott to recognize it. So what happened is you had these booklet panes, and in 1928 they switched from producing them on flat plate to the rotary press. Um, and because they were switching, they had all this extra paper that was left over that was meant to be used on the flat plate for these booklet panes, but they no longer needed it. And so from July 11th to October 27th that year, they decided that they would use this paper on the regular flatbed 400 subjects. The flat plate printing requires the paper to be wetted so that the ink can be forced up and absorbed into the paper. When the paper dries, it shrinks 4 times more across the grain of paper than with the grain of paper. So the shrinkage is not universal in all axes of the paper. So regular paper for regular stamps had the grain running lengthwise along the long dimension of the sheet, whereas special paper has the grain running across the sheet horizontally. And again, this is because they wanted that shrinkage for the booklet pane. It had to do with the way the stamps were oriented. They wanted it in one direction versus the other direction. Basically, special paper has grain running across the paper, which causes it to be wider when you have a vertical formatted image or shorter when you have a horizontal image. And so these are the Scott numbers for that. And again, we're talking, these were in inches. I tried to find millimeters. We're talking extremely small changes. This is a whole level I wasn't up to measuring on my stamp. So you have to be very savvy with your measurement. You know what would be handy is Arnie's Stamp Analyzer app, which does its measurements. That would definitely be able to show if you've got a special paper stamp or not. So I just want to summarize or end up with the Bureau. These stamps really symbolize a period of really significant technical experiments and advancements in stamp production. And the transition was not linear. This is where I, as a newbie, was coming in expecting like, okay, they'll transition from flat place to rotary, and then they'll transition to new gum, and then but you don't. You see this sort of back and forth all the way through this period. And the focus was on economy, and that led to these anomalies appearing, like the sheet waste or the special paper. And it's really an area of complexity that is fun to collect if you understand all the technical issues. So the key takeaways is you should have a solid understanding of the technical philatelic terms. You can use this knowledge to tackle your own fourth bureau collection because these stamps can be very common. And as we talked about, there's very rare ones that are still out there to be found within the common accumulations. And maybe you'll even find your own hidden gem. So
And
just key identifiers, both the flat plate press and the rotary press were used during this time. So you need to be able to distinguish between them. The coil stamps were the first made on the coil stamps were the rotary press essentially. Rotary press stamps are elongated either along the vertical or horizontal axis. You need to understand your perforations. They were experimenting with a lot of different perforation sizes, so this is really, really key. And then you need to understand the types. So there's the regular stamps, which are the common ones. Then you have your coil waste, your sheet waste, as well as your special paper. And that's it. Thank you.